My wife announced that she loved another man, and while her eyes waited for me to burn with jealousy, beg, scream, or even plead with her to stay, what she saw was my calm. A calm that didn't come from indifference, but from a perfect balance between weariness and dignity. I looked at her for long seconds, perhaps long enough for her to realize how much everything was changing, how each word that came out of her mouth silently tore at the memory of who we once were, and then I simply said, "Then go away with the one you love, and I'll move on with my life with or without you." And in that moment, I saw her lose herself. Not in a scream or a tear, but in a brittle silence. She expected resistance. She expected a scandal, a fight. She expected, perhaps, that I would fall to my knees and try to win her back. But all she found was firmness, a kind of goodbye she couldn't process. And she left. She left like someone who believes they're changing paths to find happiness, like someone who thinks true love can be replaced by adrenaline, empty promises, or the heat of the forbidden. And I stayed. Not out of weakness, but by choice. Because while she went off in search of something new, I looked inward and began to pick up the pieces of myself. That night, the silence in the house was deafening. Her absence screamed from every corner, but I refused to respond. I didn't search for her scent on the pillow, I didn't revisit old messages, I didn't wish to go back in time. Instead, I made coffee, sat on the couch, and allowed myself to be silent with myself. Because some pains don't ask for comfort, they ask for space. And there, in that cold room, I realized that my heart wasn't broken by her choosing someone else, but by the way she'd forgotten everything we'd built, as if it had no weight, as if it hadn't been real. It's not betrayal that destroys a love. It's the contempt with which everything it once was is thrown away. Months passed. And I rebuilt. Not quickly, nor easily. Each day was a small challenge. Relearning to sleep without her body beside me. Cooking for just one. Making plans without saying, "we." Responding to friends who still asked about her. But time is a silent ally, and without realizing it, I started laughing again. Going out, becoming interested in other conversations, looking into another person's eyes and feeling something different from comparison. I met someone. And it wasn't immediate, nor cinematic. It was light. It was sincere. It was whole. She didn't come to heal wounds, but to show that I was already healed. Meanwhile, on the other side of the story, she was beginning to understand that the love she'd traded everything for wasn't love at all. It was vanity, a misinterpreted emotion. The other man enjoyed the secrecy, the conquest, the adrenaline of taking what wasn't his. But when routine set in, he pulled away. When she stopped being his lover and became his available woman, he lost interest. And she began to notice. First in small gestures, unanswered messages, flimsy excuses, unexplained absences. Then in harsher attitudes, he avoided her in public, refused to talk about the future, maintained emotional distance. Until the day he simply disappeared. And she, who had left believing she was heading for a fresh start full of promise, found herself alone. Alone with the weight of regret and the guilt of having torn apart a true story for something that hadn't even been real. She returned. Without makeup, without memorized apologies. She returned with her eyes downcast and her pride shattered. She asked for forgiveness. Not to rebuild the past, but to try to staunch the pain of having destroyed it. I listened to her. Not with anger, nor with pity. But with the serenity of someone who had already left that chapter behind. I said I forgave her. Because holding on to resentment would be like keeping a candle lit that had already gone out. But there was no more room for her in my life. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because another story was already being written. And when she saw my new partner, when she witnessed that look of care, that silent respect that overflowed in every gesture between us, it was then that she understood. That she had lost me. Not only as a husband, but as a man, as a friend, as a presence. And for the first time, I saw in her eyes something she had never shown me before, pain. Genuine pain. The kind that has no remedy. The kind that comes when you understand there is no going back. The cruelest thing about regret is that it always arrives after time has already closed the door. And no matter how much she tried to retrace her steps, recall conversations, and rearrange memories to justify what she did, nothing changed the fact that she chose. She chose to leave. She chose to change. He chose to hurt me to live an illusion. And now, she was living the consequences of that choice. The days following our reunion were silent. She watched me from afar, heard about me from others, and contented herself with traces. Because the presence she once ignored was now absent. Because the home she abandoned was now someone else's. Because the love she threw away now blossomed in another heart. And yet, something even more painful awaited her. Because it wasn't the new woman who destroyed her most. Nor my absence. Nor the rejection. What truly shattered her was the realization that everything she'd experienced with me, that love, that security, that constant affection, that certainty, was anything but ordinary. And by trying to find that in other arms, in other stories, in other people, she discovered that what we had was unique. Irreplaceable. And that she lost it. Not by accident. But by choice. Some nights, before bed, she'd review old messages. She'd reminisce about trips, birthdays, trivial kitchen conversations. She'd watch videos of us laughing at things no one else would understand. She'd look for signs, find flaws, try to convince herself that perhaps our love was also worn out. But she couldn't find any. And that's when the pain would return, even stronger. Because knowing you've lost something that was still alive, is a torture you never forget. And me? I carried on. Head held high. Without hate, without anger, without haste. Because when we truly love and are betrayed, the greatest response we can give is not contempt. It's peace. The peace of knowing we were whole. That we loved with everything. That we truly gave ourselves. And yet, we were left. This doesn't diminish us. It elevates us. Because being left isn't a failure. Failure is trading love for fantasy. And that's exactly what she did. Fate doesn't shout. It whispers. And it was in one of those silent whispers that she understood what she had lost. Not just any man. Not just any relationship. But a true, deep, and rare love, the kind you only find once in a lifetime. And once you leave, you never come back. But what she didn't expect was what was yet to come. Because the love she threw away not only blossomed elsewhere, it also revealed something she could never have imagined. Something that would forever change the meaning of regret. And that's where the story really begins. Welcome to the channel. Here, we don't romanticize or justify any kind of betrayal. All the stories you hear are fiction, but they carry a profound truth. Betrayal destroys homes, hearts and lives. Our goal is to show, with each plot, that what is lost due to ego or impulse, cannot always be recovered. Get ready. What's coming next is a story. Shocking, intense and unforgettable. Enjoy listening. They met on an ordinary afternoon, like so many others that pass unnoticed in the rush of routine. He was leaving a small cafe with a narrow sidewalk and makeshift tables when he bumped into her, a slight collision, but enough to knock over the papers she was carrying against her chest. He bent down to help her, and in the reflection, their eyes met. Nothing about that moment was extraordinary, but there was an unsettling calm in that look. A kind of silent recognition between two strangers. She smiled awkwardly. He asked if everything was okay, and when she answered, her voice rang out like music on a too noisy day. After that, fate took over. Their encounters began to happen as if planned, but neither of them had the courage to admit they were expecting them. Weeks passed until their first dinner, a discreet restaurant, conversation flowing effortlessly, shy laughter between sips of wine and lingering glances. There were no promises at that first meeting, just the feeling that something was being born, something that didn't need to be named yet, but that was already being felt throughout the body. His name was Daniel, and he was the kind of man who builds himself over time. Nothing about him screamed for attention. He wasn't the most handsome man in the room, nor the most charismatic, but he had a solid presence, a calm assurance that inspired trust from the first handshake. He worked in graphic design, spending hours in front of the computer creating shapes and colors that reflected the feelings of brands and people. He loved silence, order, the comfort of small daily rituals. I read books on human behavior. I found it fascinating to understand why people feel the way they do. He never had many friends, but the ones he did have were like brothers. His greatest pleasure was cooking on Sundays, listening to jazz while preparing simple, thoughtful dishes. And even with his reserved nature, there was a generosity about him that spread throughout the room. He was the kind of person who listened attentively, who remembered details said in a distracted way, who turned affection into a subtle language. Her name was Laura, and she was like an open window on a sultry day. She had energy in her gestures, a sparkle in her eyes, a kind of joy that seemed to never tire of existing. She worked in marketing at a fashion company and was constantly surrounded by people, screens, and trends. She was creative, spontaneous, a bit impulsive at times, but with a huge and sincere heart. She loved mornings, waking up early even on weekends, and enjoyed walking aimlessly to people watch. She found it easy to make friends, to be present, to fill the space with her firm voice and wide laugh. But behind her evident joy, there was also a woman full of layers, with scars no one saw, with insecurities kept under lock and key. She had lost her mother early, and this had left her with a hunger for belonging, an almost desperate desire to be loved without being left behind. Their beginnings were light, almost intuitive. They spent hours together, and the silences between conversations were never uncomfortable. Laura was captivated by Daniel's calm, his way of seeing the world with less haste and more depth. He, on the other hand, was fascinated by the light she radiated, by her way of living everything intensely, of throwing herself into each moment as if it were unique. The balance between them came not from similarity, but from contrast. She made him laugh like he hadn't laughed in a long time. He made her feel safe in a way no one else had. Their connection grew unnoticed, and before they knew it, they were already in love. They lived together for 2 years before their wedding. They built the house with care, choosing every detail with patience and affection. The walls gained color, the kitchen came alive, the paintings told stories of travels, lazy Sundays, and rainy nights dancing without music in the middle of the living room. It wasn't a movie life, but it was real. They had their differences, their arguments, of course, but there was respect. There was listening. There was, above all, a mutual desire to stay. When they decided to get married, it wasn't because of pressure, nor because of third-party expectations. It was because they knew that, despite all the ups and downs, they wanted to continue choosing each other. The wedding was intimate, with close friends and family gathered in a simple but beautiful garden. Daniel wore a light gray suit and a shy but firm smile. Laura was radiant, wearing a light dress with her hair flowing in the wind. When they exchanged vows, they didn't promise perfection, but they did promise commitment, patience, and truth. That afternoon seemed to seal an ancient promise, as if the universe confirmed that two such different worlds had met at the right time. After that came the small routines that made up their daily lives. The hurried breakfasts, the leisurely dinners, the Friday night movies, the Sunday walks in the park. There was no boredom, there was constancy. And this constancy, often underestimated, was what sustained their love. Laura, with her intense nature, sometimes seemed restless. She dreamed of traveling more, trying out different routines, having new experiences. Daniel was more centered, preferring stability and deep connections. And although this created small tensions, they both learned to compromise, to find balance. He began to open himself more to new things, and she learned to value the peace he offered. Over time, they developed a silent code between them, a way to read each other without having to say everything out loud. There were days when a touch on the shoulder was enough to calm a storm, others when a look was enough to bring reason back. To outsiders, they were a solid couple, the kind that inspires. Friends admired them, family always praised their partnership, the way they respected each other despite their differences. And indeed, there was love. A love planted with care, watered daily with small gestures. It wasn't a fairy tale, it was a story built with real bricks, with effort, with choice. When they faced difficulties, they didn't run away. They sat, talked, cried, reevaluated. They had plans, yes, they talked about children, about moving to a new city, about learning a new language together. But they also lived in the present with presence, enjoying the ordinary days as if they understood that the extraordinary is hidden in the everyday. As time passed, life began to change in almost imperceptible ways. Lara began to engage in new projects, meet new people, and expand her horizons. Daniel, as always, was supportive, even if he sometimes felt something in him was getting lost along the way. He didn't say it. He kept it to himself. Perhaps out of fear of appearing controlling, perhaps because he trusted too much in the solidity of what they had built. Lara, for her part, was experiencing a whirlwind of new sensations. She felt alive, challenged, pulsing with a kind of energy she hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't dissatisfaction with her marriage. It was more of an inner restlessness she couldn't name. A kind of need to reconnect with parts of herself that had lain dormant. But even with this new phase, they remained together. Dinners continued to happen. Hands still sought each other in bed. Texts in the middle of the day, even brief ones, still existed. Daniel felt something was changing, but he tried to convince himself it was just time, the accumulation of responsibilities, adult life taking its place. Lara tried to convince herself she was simply reinventing herself, and that none of this interfered with the love she felt. And so, between silent doubts and shouted certainties, they continued. Still united. Still believing. Still loving. But every story carries within it a seed of what is yet to come. An unexplained gesture, a silence longer than usual, an absence that goes unnoticed in a rush, but screams when alone. There was a bend in the road they couldn't yet see. A bend that would change everything. And at that bend, what would come to light was not just a hidden truth, but the most painful realization of all, that sometimes, love isn't enough to stop someone from leaving. The rhythm of their routine had changed, but unhurriedly. Gradually, what was once spontaneous became measured. Conversations diminished in depth, silences lengthened, and although the gestures of affection still existed, something now hovered between them like an invisible layer of distance. Daniel felt it, though he didn't say it. Not because he didn't want to, but because he believed that the deepest bonds would survive the awkward moments. Lara, on the other hand, was in constant motion, her world seemed faster, fuller, more restless. There was always a new meeting, a new idea, a new person to talk to. She began arriving home later, first out of necessity, then out of convenience. When questioned, she would say that work was demanding, that everything was fine, that he didn't need to worry. And he believed. Not out of naivete, but out of faith. Faith in the story they had built. Faith in the woman he knew. Faith in the love they swore to cultivate. Over time, small changes became more frequent. The cell phone was always carried everywhere, even inside the house. Messages were responded to more quickly, sometimes with a muffled laugh and no explanation. Lara's gaze would wander during dinners, her attention seemed scattered even in the most intimate conversations. Daniel began to notice, but didn't mention it. He watched. He waited. A man accustomed to respecting the time and space of the woman he loved. But something inside him began to stir silently, a dull discomfort, an intuition that grew like a constant whisper deep within his soul. There was no proof, no certainty. There was only the instinct of someone who knows another not just by their words, but by the tone of their breathing, the way they touched their fork, the weight of their footsteps as they walked through the door. Lara was growing impatient. Small criticisms became frequent, as if everything Daniel did or didn't do was out of step. Sometimes he tried to broach a deeper topic, but was met with clipped sentences, monosyllabic answers, and weary looks. She said she was exhausted. She said she needed space. She said he no longer understood her. And he, wounded, tried to adjust, tried to offer more, tried to understand. He changed his habits, learned to cook dishes she liked, started waiting for her awake even in the wee hours. But it was as if nothing was enough. As if any effort was just another drop in an already full cup. The feeling of inadequacy enveloped him like a rough blanket, making his days heavier and his nights longer. He still loved her. That was certain. But he was beginning to wonder if that love was reciprocated with the same intensity. One Saturday afternoon, Lara said she was going out with a friend from work. Daniel, though surprised by the lack of mention earlier, simply hoped she would enjoy it. He stayed home, cleaning, listening to music, trying to silence the restlessness that had taken over his chest. The hours passed. Night fell. And she didn't return. She sent a short message, saying she would sleep at her friend's house because they had a few drinks and it was too late to drive. Daniel replied with an "okay" that carried the weight of 1,000 suspicions. He slept poorly. He woke to the sound of a key in the door shortly after 9. She walked in naturally, showered, got dressed, and began talking about how exhausted she was. Daniel watched her. Every gesture. Every sentence. He felt there was a rehearsed script behind everything. But he kept quiet. Not out of cowardice, but because he didn't want to be unfair. Deep down, he still hoped he was wrong. In the following weeks, Lara began going out more frequently. And with fewer explanations. When he asked, she said she needed to experience other things, that she was feeling stuck, that he couldn't expect her to be the same woman she'd always been. The words hurt. But what hurt more was the indifference with which they were spoken. As if he had become a piece of furniture in the house. Present, but without emotional value. Still, Daniel remained. He tried to maintain the routine, tried to recapture old gestures. He bought flowers, prepared dinners, proposed short trips. But his attempts were always met with a forced smile or an evasive excuse. The intimacy between them became rarefied. Kisses were hurried. Touches were cold. Their bodies were distant. Daniel began to question himself. He wondered if he had become invisible, if he had ceased to be enough. He searched within himself for reasons that could justify the abyss growing between them. At night, when she slept on her back, he would look at her and wonder where the days of laughing together until they were breathless were. Where were the Sundays of movies and pillows, the shared electrical outlets, the hands clasped on the steering wheel? The woman who shared his bed was now almost a stranger. And the most painful thing was that, even so, he still loved her just as strongly as before. Or maybe more, because love, when threatened, sometimes becomes even more desperate to exist. One day, while rummaging through a drawer for a document, Daniel found a note. A small, folded piece of paper with a phrase written in a feminine handwriting, but it wasn't Lara's. "You make everything seem easier. I can't wait for tomorrow." The phrase wasn't direct, but it was too intimate to be innocent. His heart stopped for a second. His hand trembled. He reread it several times, as if searching for a misinterpretation. He put the note back in the same place. And said nothing. Over the next few days, he began to observe even more. Noting details he'd previously ignored. Lara was absent in the late afternoons more frequently, changed her clothes even for virtual meetings, wore a different perfume, received messages and quickly hid them. Daniel didn't confront her. He began to live with the suspicion like someone carrying an open wound under their clothes. It was a throbbing pain, but he needed to be sure before he could put it into words. It was a Wednesday afternoon when everything came together. Lara left, saying she was going to happy hour with colleagues. She said she wouldn't be long. Daniel, seized by an impulse he didn't recognize in himself, decided to follow her. He felt ashamed of what he was doing, but a part of him could no longer bear living in doubt. He parked the car far away and watched. She entered an office building, walked to the back, and then a man appeared. Smiles. A kiss. A hug too long to be just friendship. And then they went upstairs together. Daniel didn't need to see anything else. He got back into the car. Started the engine. And stood there for long minutes, staring at the steering wheel, trying to breathe. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just understood. He understood that what he felt wasn't just pain. It was grief. A silent grief for the end of a story he hadn't finished. That night, Lara returned as if nothing had happened. She kissed him on the cheek, said she was tired, that the wine was good. Daniel nodded, prepared dinner, and they sat at the table. They chatted about trivialities. He watched her attentively, as if seeing for the last time something they loved deeply. She didn't notice. She was relaxed, perhaps even relieved, as if everything was under control. But something in Daniel had changed. His posture, his gaze, his silence. And that early morning, lying beside her, he decided he wouldn't ask for explanations. That he wouldn't demand remorse. That he wouldn't stoop to the same level of lying. Because his pain deserved more than screams. It deserved respect. The next morning, Lara woke to find him in the kitchen. He calmly looked at her and told her he knew. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't insult her, he didn't plead. He simply told her she was free to follow her heart, but he would follow his too. And in that instant, her expression changed. Because she hadn't expected it. She'd expected scandal. She'd expected begging. She'd expected a fight. But what she received was freedom. And that, for her, was more frightening than any confrontation. But what she didn't yet know, was that the true impact of her choice was yet to come. And with it, the revelation of something that would change everything forever. The real impact wasn't the moment of betrayal, nor the coldness with which she left. What crushed everything was the moment she realized she'd been deeply mistaken, and that the love she'd thrown away her entire life for was nothing more than a broken mirror, beautiful from afar, dangerous up close. In the first few days after the breakup, Lara maintained a haughty expression, trying to convince herself she'd done the right thing. She told some friends that she needed freedom, that she deserved to find herself again, that Daniel was a good man, but he wasn't the right man anymore. She held a blind belief that all of this would lead her to a better place, as if she'd finally listened to her heart and found the courage to live what she truly wanted. The new relationship was, at first, a breath of fresh air that numbed the weight of her choices. There were warm messages, secret encounters, and the adrenaline of everything lived in the dark. Lara felt desired, alive, as if she'd returned to the woman she'd been before. But it was smoke, and the air began to thin faster than she expected. The man she was involved with seemed, at first, willing to do anything. He promised trips, future plans, and said he admired her courage. But time began to reveal other layers. The messages diminished. The once sweet words became practical. The calls became rarer. And on the few occasions they were together, she felt his gaze no longer rested on her in the same way. One day, in a casual conversation, he mentioned a trip he was taking alone. When she suggested accompanying him, he hesitated, smiled with uncomfortable kindness, and said it wasn't the right time. At first, she pretended not to mind. Then she tried to rationalize. But slowly, insecurity began to gnaw at her. She felt uninvited from a story she thought she was writing together. She tried to force her presence, to rekindle the spark, but everything seemed to slip through her fingers. The new love that had seemed so promising proved shallow, and now she was beginning to wonder what she had truly left behind. Months passed. Lara now lived alone in a rented apartment, smaller, quiet, and full of reflections. She no longer spoke with the same enthusiasm to her friends, avoided meetings, and became more reclusive. Sundays were long. Nights were sleepless. She stared at her phone, waiting for messages that never arrived. Sometimes she thought of Daniel, but quickly pushed the thought away like someone trying to close a door with the wind pushing against it. Until one day, in a market, her eyes met his. It was quick, unexpected. He was with another woman. And there was nothing forced or exaggerated about that scene. It was simple, the two of them were choosing fruit, talking quietly, laughing about something trivial. And it was there, standing between the shelves, that Lara felt a lump rise in her throat. Not from jealousy, but from something much deeper, from realizing he was okay. And that what he now offered to another woman was the same thing he had once offered to her. But this time, there was reciprocity. That same night, she reached out to him. She sent a short message, asking to talk. He responded politely, arranging to meet for coffee in a public place. When he arrived, Lara was surprised. He was lighter. There was a sparkle in his eyes she hadn't seen in a long time. They sat down, and she tried to gently make conversation, but a wall stood between them. And she knew she couldn't blame him for it. She apologized. She said she'd gotten confused, that she hadn't known how to deal with the changes she'd been experiencing. She confessed to deep regret, that she'd realized too late the value of the love they'd built. Daniel listened calmly, and when he responded, it was firm but respectful. He said he didn't hate her. That he had suffered, yes, but that he was now at peace. He said he understood her search, but that he was no longer part of it. He told her he'd met someone, but not arrogantly, with gratitude. Because, according to him, sometimes pain puts us on paths we would never choose on our own, but which take us exactly where we need to be. Lara lowered her eyes, tried to hold back the tears, and in the urge of grief, asked if there was any chance. Any chance? Daniel was silent for a moment, and then said no. Not because he was hurt, but because the love she left behind was not one that could be recovered. It was a love that had been permanently wounded. And it was at that moment that the real impact hit. Because Lara, for the first time, didn't just hear the consequences of her choice. She saw them. She touched them. She understood. Days later, I learned from a mutual friend that he had burned all the letters she had ever written. The cherished notes, the photos, the small mementos that marked the details of their relationship. Everything had been reduced to ashes. And not as revenge. But as liberation. Because he had decided to no longer carry the burden. What, for her, was part of history, for him had become a drag. And he wanted to move on. With everything clean. With everything over. This information hit her like a blade. Because until then, even after everything, she believed there might be some hidden spark, something that still belonged to her in his heart. But knowing he'd burned it all away was like losing, all over again, a love she'd never known how to cherish. And that's when Lara truly broke. It wasn't the rejection. It was the absence of his return. The certainty that he no longer belonged in the story she tried to reclaim. In a final farewell gesture, she saw him again, in a chance encounter. He was with his new partner, and this time he didn't see her. Lara stood across the street, watching. She saw them looking at each other the way she and Daniel had looked at each other in the beginning. She saw him run his hand through her hair with that tenderness that had once been his. She saw the lightness he carried, and understood that that would never come back to her. No matter how much she regretted it. No matter how much she apologized. Because time never comes back. And some mistakes, no matter how human, cost too much. And then she understood that what she had lost wasn't just a partner. It wasn't just a relationship. It was a love that rebuilt her, that saw her through even on days when she didn't even recognize herself. It was a man who chose her when she still doubted herself. And traded him for false brilliance, for promises that evaporated, for a romance that couldn't bear the weight of everyday life. Now it was too late. But what she never knew, and would never fully know, was that the real shock wasn't the betrayal, nor the regret. What she could never have imagined was that, deep down, Daniel had known everything long before she confessed. And that, even so, he had chosen silence. Because silence, for those who truly love, is more powerful than any revenge. And that in that silence lay a farewell far more profound than any goodbye spoken aloud. It was this silence that would accompany her for the rest of her life. Days after that encounter, the air between them felt officially different. As if something, invisible yet immense, had been relocated in space. Lara returned home with her body erect and her heart completely fractured. There was no anger in Daniel's words, nor any bitterness, which made everything even harder to process. The forgiveness she had received didn't taste like consolation, but rather like a full stop. And a full stop said with respect hurts much more than a desperate scream. She wanted screams. She wanted to see pain in his eyes. She wanted signs that there was still love suffocated beneath the hurt. But she found only serenity. And that shattered any silent hope she still harbored. It was as if, there, she had witnessed the wake of a story that, somewhere in her memory, she still believed was alive. After that, Lara began to live like someone trying to rebuild a house on land where everything had been demolished, but with bare hands. It was a routine of mechanical repetitions, soulless tasks, social laughter that didn't touch the eyes. Friends noticed her absence even when she was present. The vitality that had once enchanted her was now replaced by a constant restlessness, as if something inside her was perpetually in a state of fugue. She tried to resume old hobbies, revisit old photos, reread archived conversations, but nothing brought peace. Even the places where she'd been happy began to ache. Returning to the park where they'd walked, passing by bakeries where they'd bought bread in the late afternoon, listening to the songs they'd shared on lazy Sundays, all of that was now like an open wound exposed to the sun. It hurt to breathe the same air. And Daniel? His life went on. He and Clara, the name of the new woman he'd met months after their separation, were building something beautiful. But with ease. Clara didn't come to take up anyone's space, nor to heal old pains. She appeared at the right time, with the right intensity, with a love that didn't demand anything, didn't require bandages, just presence. It was different from anything he'd experienced with Lara, and precisely for that reason, it was right. Clara had a silent but firm gaze. She spoke little, but listened deeply. And little by little, Daniel began to understand the value of a calm love, without storms, without discord. He slept well again, smiled without fear, and believed in reciprocity as a possible place. It was during a charity event, a dinner hosted by mutual friends, that Daniel and Lara saw each other again, this time closer. She hesitated when she saw him enter with Clara, but decided to maintain her composure. She walked up to him and greeted him with a brief, restrained smile. Daniel, polite as always, returned it respectfully. They chatted superficially about the event, their friends, and the weather. At another point in their lives, this kind of reunion might have been fraught with tension or nostalgia. But that night, there was only a void between them. A silence that was no longer uncomfortable, but definitive. Yet, something unexpected happened later, when Lara approached Clara at the event's makeshift bar. The two exchanged formal greetings, a brief conversation over the wine served. But it was at that moment that Clara smiled and said, with disconcerting ease, "Thank you for leaving him. It was the greatest gift you ever gave me." That Lara's world fell apart again. There was no sarcasm, no irony. Just a certainty spoken softly, but it resonated within her like thunder. That phrase was like a sentence. Because it didn't come from rivalry, but from peace. And realizing that another woman was occupying the space that was once hers, and doing so with dignity, was more than loss. It was punishment. She tried to hide her shock, but her hands trembled as she held the glass. She left with her entire body asking to crumble. It wasn't envy. It was pure regret. The pain of having destroyed a place that now belonged to someone else. A place she would never be invited back to. That same night, when she got home, she sat on the floor of the dark living room, with the lights off. She looked around and realized there was no one there to comfort her. For the first time, she felt that loneliness wasn't the absence of people, but the absence of those who truly mattered. She picked up her phone, opened Daniel's contact information, but didn't write anything. She deleted it. She turned on the music low, some random instrumental music, and cried. A silent cry, without sobs, but with a pain that seemed to come from deep within her bones. There, she was no longer crying for him. She was crying for herself. For having been the author of her own tragedy. The following days became more intense. She tried to move on with her life, with her commitments, with the appearance of normality. But there was something she couldn't get out of her head. Why had Daniel never really confronted her? Why had he just accepted and moved on? Why had he never asked for details, never demanded explanations, never sought to understand what had really happened? This question began to lodge itself within her like an obsession. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized he knew more than he was letting on. She needed to know. She needed to hear from him. Not to change what had happened, but to understand. So, days later, she summoned the courage and sought him out one last time. They met in a park, far from the city center, where they used to go at the beginning of their relationship. Daniel arrived punctually, as always. He was calm, with the clear gaze of someone who no longer carries baggage. They sat on a wooden bench, and for a moment, the silence between them made time seem static. Lara took a deep breath and, in a low voice, asked, "You already knew, didn't you? Even before I told you. You knew I was with someone else." Daniel took a moment to respond, but when he spoke, his voice held no hurt, just a gentle weariness. "Yes. I knew. Long before. But understanding that you were cheating on me hurt less than admitting that you didn't love me anymore." Lara closed her eyes. Her chest tightened. She hadn't expected such clarity, such rawness. Daniel continued, now staring ahead, at an undefined point on the horizon. "I noticed it in the details. In the way you started looking at me less. In the way your words grew cold. The day you slept out for the first time and lied about where you were, I knew. I just didn't say anything. Because I didn't want to hear you lie again. And because I understood that losing you was inevitable. But losing me was your choice." Those words pierced Lara like a knife. She tried to respond, but couldn't find the words to fix it. And then, with tears in her eyes, she asked, "Why didn't you ever stop me? Why didn't you try to bring me back?" Daniel turned to her, and for the first time in that conversation, pain appeared in his eyes, because love is not asked for. It is not begged for. And I already loved myself enough not to reduce myself to an emotional beggar. The conversation ended there. There was no hug. There was no kiss on the forehead. Just one last look, the kind of look that carries the pain of everything that could have been, but wasn't. Daniel got up first and left unhurriedly. Lara remained. Alone, as in the beginning. But now with the weight of all the answers I never wanted to hear. On the way back, she finally understood that losing a great love isn't like losing something replaceable. It's like losing a piece of one's own history. And that, unlike in movies, in real life, some choices can't be reenacted. And certain losses, no matter how much time passes, hurt like the first day. After that last encounter, Lara spent days immersed in a kind of silence that isn't just the absence of sound, but the absence of herself. The answer she received from Daniel left no room for hope, nor did it even allow room for dialogue. It was a naked, unlayered truth, delivered with the serenity of someone who had cried everything and now simply chose dignity. She walked home slowly, as if every meter took her further away from something that would never be recovered. That night, she slept without tears, but with her chest squeezed by an almost physical weight. It was a silence without catharsis, without a cry, only filled with emptiness. For the first time, she didn't desire comfort, nor distraction, nor a new chance. She simply wished she hadn't been the one responsible for destroying the only love that truly made sense in her life. In the following days, the memories began to come with a different texture. No longer as painful flashes or emotional punishments, but as scenes from an old movie, in which she was both protagonist and villain. He began to revisit places without needing to physically go there. The smell of coffee in the morning took her back to the times he'd silently prepare breakfast, just to see her smile, her eyes still puffy with sleep. The sound of the rain against the window brought back memories of his body pressed against hers on the sofa, a torn blanket, and a feeling that the whole world fit inside that small room. These weren't memories that came with anger or revolt. They were memories that, ironically, she could only now see clearly, as if during their time together she'd been too busy searching for an invented love instead of perceiving the love that was already there, whole, quiet, loyal. And this placed her in a difficult dilemma to digest. Because regret for wrong choices is always bitter, but it becomes unbearable when the consequences of the choice can no longer be reversed. She began to wonder what kind of person she had become to be capable of destroying something so precious out of impulse, out of need, out of an illusion of freedom. He wasn't seeking redemption. He knew he no longer had that right. But she needed to understand. She needed to confront herself with brutal honesty. He began writing letters to no one. Accounts of everything she felt, like a desperate attempt to put into words the chaos that consumed her inside. Sometimes she wrote as if speaking to him, sometimes as if speaking to a younger version of herself, trying to prevent herself from making the mistake before it was too late. But the truth, stark and raw, is that time cannot be reversed. And as much as pain teaches, some lessons only serve to fuel regret, not to mend the past. Meanwhile, Daniel lived a present that wasn't perfect, but it was clean. With Clara, things unfolded naturally, like a piece finally fitting together after so many failed attempts. He still bore marks, true, but they weren't open wounds. They were scars from old battles he'd learned not to hide, but also not to let define his future. He didn't talk about Laura. He didn't keep objects that reminded him of his previous relationship. And when her name came up in casual conversation, he simply nodded, without rancor, but also without curiosity. Because there are pains that end not in forgiveness, but in the absence of any desire to remember. But even with life moving on, there was one thing left unresolved: the bonds Laura had destroyed weren't limited to their relationship. There were family, friends, connections built over the years. And when Daniel began introducing Clara to people close to him, many of those connections made it clear how much he had changed. Comments like, "You're lighter, you seem like a different man," or, "It's good to see you truly happy," weren't just compliments, but reflections of something everyone noticed but never said out loud: how much Laura had slowly extinguished his light during their time together. And now, seeing Daniel reborn alongside someone who treated him with respect, with kindness, provoked a kind of silent justice in others. As if everyone were slowly reshaping their judgments about the story, understanding that perhaps he had always been the only one of the two who truly loved. Laura began to feel this way too. People who were once close now greeted her formally. Mutual friends avoided certain topics, some didn't even respond to messages. There wasn't hostility, but a subtle distancing, as if the world had moved on and she had been left behind. And deep down, she knew this was fair. Losing a love is devastating. But also losing respect, trust, and credibility in the eyes of others is a sentence that stretches on and on. The feeling of displacement became inevitable. The places she frequented now seemed to belong to a previous version of her, one that no longer existed. And, worse, she felt she had been replaced. Not just by another woman, but by another narrative. Daniel now represented overcoming, a comeback, while she was seen as the woman who didn't know how to appreciate what she had. It was a heavy weight to bear. Even so, she tried to find meaning. She sought, amidst the pain, to understand if there was still something to learn, something that would prevent her from repeating the same mistakes with herself. She reread letters, reviewed old messages she never sent, and one morning, she found an old photo of the two of them, taken in their first year of marriage, during a simple trip. In the photo, they were holding hands in front of a wooden cabin, laughing without looking at the camera. There was something in that laughter that hurt, a spontaneity she had never felt with anyone else. And there, with her eyes fixed on that static image, she finally understood, it wasn't Daniel she had lost, it was the woman she was when she was with him. And that, perhaps, was the most irreparable loss of all. In the following days, she began making small changes. Not as an attempt to win him back, that idea had already died, but as a way to stop being the person who destroyed the truest love she'd ever known. She went back to school, started therapy, and reconnected with her own essence, something she'd abandoned long before the betrayal. She began writing about what she'd experienced, not as a way to vent, but as someone trying to transform pain into a lesson. In a text she published anonymously, she wrote, "There is no greater sin than realizing, too late, that you were loved deeply and didn't know how to reciprocate. And when you realize it, the love is gone. And with it, the best version of yourself." And while she tried to rebuild herself in silence, Daniel walked toward a new phase of his life. A discreet engagement, a long-term travel plan with Clara, and a tranquility visible in his eyes. The story with Laura, though over, still existed within him, but now as if it were a book kept on the shelf, not to reread, but to remember what was learned. Some nights, I would think briefly about everything they'd experienced, but not with longing. With respect. Because some stories don't need to be denied. They just need to be left where they ended. Laura, for her part, faced a moral dilemma that tore her apart. She had been forgiven, but she couldn't forgive herself. She knew that moving on meant accepting that she would never again have what she lost. But at the same time, she felt she couldn't live trapped in what no longer existed. She was caught between guilt and starting over. Between the desire for punishment and the need to allow herself a second chance. And this internal conflict consumed her more powerfully than any external judgment. Because the betrayal she committed wasn't just against Daniel. It was against everything she claimed to believe in. Against love, against loyalty, against truth. And now, she would have to deal with the echo of it every day, in every gesture, in every future choice. And so, while one walked on in peace, and the other tried to relearn how to breathe without pain, life went on. Because time doesn't stop for those who make mistakes, nor for those who suffer. It simply moves on. And it's up to each person to decide whether to move forward or remain trapped in what has already fallen apart. But what Laura didn't yet know, was that the hardest lesson of that story was yet to come. A truth that didn't involve Daniel or Clara, but something only she could face, and that would forever change the way she would look at her own reflection. Routine no longer surprised her, and this, for Laura, was the starkest reflection of what she had become. What had once been absence was now habit. Loneliness no longer hurt as it once did, but it weighed heavily. A constant, silent weight, which she bore with bitter dignity. She passed her days functionally, fulfilling her commitments, responding to necessary messages, attending unavoidable meetings. But there was an emptiness that occupied everything, as if she were in a room where the air had been drained. She walked the streets as if searching for something without knowing what it was, looking at the faces around her, hoping to find some reflection of herself, but only saw strangers. She had learned to smile out of politeness, to speak out of obligation, to exist out of resistance. And even with all her efforts to reorganize her life, memories returned at the most unlikely moments. In the middle of a meeting, when opening a random drawer, when she smelled a spice he used to use. The past wasn't a visitor, it was a tenant. On a particularly hot weekend, she decided to accept a coworker's invitation to spend 2 days at a mountain lodge. It wasn't for the scenery, nor the relaxation, but for the desire to escape herself. In her luggage, she packed the bare necessities and a new notebook, where she planned to write something that would help her breathe again. Once there, the atmosphere was calm, almost bucolic. Tall trees, the sound of birds, and a silence that seemed to be peaceful. But inside her, the noise was different. On the second night, after a simple dinner and some superficial conversation, she decided to walk alone along the trail that led to the region's viewpoint. She brought her notebook, a pen, and a blanket. She sat on a large, moss-covered rock and began to write. The words came out hesitantly, as if being drawn by something greater. On one page, she wrote, "I don't know who I am after all this. I don't know if I deserve to find someone, I don't know if someone should find me. But I need to forgive myself. Even if it takes a lifetime." The sentence hung there, her eyes fixed on it for minutes. In that moment, she realized how much she still sought approval, not from others, but from herself. "I didn't want to just move on. I wanted to be someone who could look in the mirror and say, 'Now, you're trying to do it right.'" Upon returning home, he felt a different lightness. As if something had been left behind in that stone. He began to realize that there were parts of himself that were still whole. That his guilt didn't have to be eternal, even though his choices had definitive consequences. With this in mind, he decided to do something he'd been putting off for a long time: visit Daniel's parents. Not out of a desire for reconciliation, but out of respect. They had always treated her like a daughter, always fair, always generous. And she'd left them without an explanation that would do justice to what they'd experienced together. He scheduled the visit for a Sunday, and on the way there, his stomach churned in a way it hadn't felt in a long time. Upon arrival, he was greeted with surprise and a restrained hug by his mother. His father greeted her with a discreet wave. They sat on the porch and drank coffee. The conversation was formal for the first few minutes, until Laura excused herself, took a deep breath, and said, "I just needed to look you in the eyes and ask for forgiveness. Not just for what I did to Daniel, but for what I did to this family. I know nothing I say will change the facts. But you deserved at least that." Daniel's mother, a serene woman, looked at her with teary eyes and replied with cutting sweetness, "The pain we felt wasn't just for him, it was for you too. Because we knew you would realize. But we also knew that when you did, it would be too late." Laura nodded, stifling her tears. They fell silent. It was the kind of forgiveness that came not with absolution, but with humanity. That visit, however brief, was a turning point. She understood that her pain, however deep, was not isolated. That there was debris scattered in places she never imagined it would cause damage. And this made her change the way she viewed her own mistakes. Not as scars I needed to display, but as marks I needed to respect. Weeks followed with new habits. She resumed writing classes, reconnected with a distant cousin, and started visiting a community center on Saturdays to help with reading workshops for teenagers. It wasn't an attempt at redemption, it was a genuine effort to rebuild. One brick a day. One choice at a time. And little by little, the image she saw of herself in the mirror began to change. There was still no pride, but there was no longer any revulsion. Meanwhile, Daniel was preparing a permanent move. Clara had received a job offer in another country, and after mature conversations, they decided to embark on a new phase together. It was a peaceful decision, without ruptures. Just the continuation of something that had been built on trust, listening, and partnership. Before they left, he made a point of stopping by the old house where he had lived with Laura, now empty and about to be rented. He opened the door with the key he still kept and entered alone. Each room was a ghost. Not in the tragic sense, but as if the objects had become imbued with memories. He walked through the living room, touched the wall where an old painting hung, passed through the kitchen, and stopped in front of the bedroom door. He didn't go in. He just looked and smiled slightly, as if thanking the past for everything it had taught him, even with the pain. He left the key on the kitchen counter, closed the door, and left. It was the final farewell, the last page. Weeks later, now on another continent, Daniel and Clara began a quieter, freer life. The lack of a shared past in their new place made everything easier. They didn't have to deal with comparisons, with stories about how it was before. It was now. A love built cleanly, without cracks. He finally felt whole. Not because he'd forgotten what he'd experienced with Laura, but because he'd learned not to live in its shadow. Laura, upon finding out about the move, felt an inevitable pang. But she didn't cry. She simply closed her eyes and wished him happiness. And, for the first time, that wish came not from a place of loss, but from gratitude. Because understanding that someone no longer belongs to you is one of the most difficult, and noblest, forms of love. And it was in this context of acceptance that she did something unexpected. She gathered her writings, old letters, reflections, and pain, and decided to publish them. Not as an autobiography, but as a fictional narrative inspired by her own journey. The title she chose was, The Woman Who Returned Too Late. The book was published by an independent publisher, with a modest print run. But something in that raw, unvarnished story resonated with people. She received messages from readers saying they recognized themselves in the pages, that her words had prevented them from making similar mistakes. And there, for the first time in years, Lara felt she had transformed pain into something that truly touched others. That, despite everything, she could offer the world something other than her own destruction. At a literary event, she was approached by a young woman who said, "Reading your book made me realize that love is more than feeling. It's caring. And sometimes, when we forget that, we lose the most important love in life." Lara held the girl's hand and replied, "I lost it. But if my story helped you not lose yours, then it was worth it." And in that moment, she knew she wasn't trying to erase her past. She was trying to honor it. Because some people live to teach. Others live to learn. And some, like her, live to make mistakes, and then turn them into beacons. The moral dilemma that haunted her had taken on a new form. She still felt guilty, of course. But now she knew she had found new meaning. She couldn't change what she had done, nor rewrite the story with Daniel. But she could write new stories from it. And perhaps, in the end, that was the true meaning of it all. What she didn't know, however, was that the final reunion with her own essence was yet to come. And it would come in the most unexpected way. On the last autumn afternoon of that year, Lara walked through the dry leaves as if crossing familiar territory, yet completely redesigned. The air was lighter, even though the last few months had been emotionally dense. Life had reorganized itself differently than she had imagined, but she was still alive, and for the first time, truly aware of what that meant. The book she had published had taken shape and voice in the hands of strangers who, curiously, seemed to know her better than many who had been with her at important moments in her life. She received messages every day, confessions, similar stories, thanks for having courageously said what many were ashamed to admit. But even with all this new presence in the world, within her there remained a silence that endured. A silence made of the absence of a real goodbye with Daniel, not a formal farewell, which had already happened, but something deeper, more human, more honest. She knew they would never be what they had been again, but she could not deny that he had been the most genuine love of her life. And loves like that, even when they leave, continue to be roots. Unable to explain why, she decided to write one last letter. Not to send. Just to write. It was more an exercise in exorcism than an attempt to make contact. She sat at the same table where, years ago, she had written loving notes to leave in his backpack, now transformed into a simple desk in the guest room of their new apartment. With the pen between her fingers and her heart calmer, she began, "If you ever read these words, I want you to know that I no longer seek your forgiveness. I have already received it. But I needed to tell you that, even after everything, the love I felt for you still visits me. Not as desire, nor as desperate longing. But as respect. As recognition. Like someone looking at a work of art that no longer belongs to them, but still moves them. Today I understand that it wasn't you I was missing, it was me. And only after losing you did I realize this." When she finished, she folded the paper and put it in a box, along with other notes that would never be read by anyone. That was the silent closure she needed. And, strangely, he felt at peace. Meanwhile, Daniel and Clara were adapting to their new life. The change had been more than geographic, it was emotional, existential. In the new city, he rediscovered parts of himself that had long been dormant. He explored unfamiliar streets with enthusiasm, made new friends, learned a new language, and, more than that, allowed himself to live without carrying guilt that no longer belonged to him. Clara watched him with admiration. It was noticeable how much lighter, more spontaneous he had become. She would say, from time to time, that he possessed a kind of beauty that came from dignity, something that could not be manufactured or imitated. It was an admiration built on care, reciprocity, and daily choice. They didn't need to promise eternity. They just needed to be whole for the duration. And that was enough. It was a cold morning, already approaching winter, that Clara found Daniel sitting on the balcony of their new apartment, gazing reflectively at the horizon. She approached and asked if he was okay. He replied with a serene smile that he was, but after a moment of silence, he added, "You know, I once loved someone with all my heart, and that person destroyed me. But even so, I don't regret having loved. Because it was through loving like that that I learned who I am." Clara approached and hugged him from behind, without saying anything. She knew that memory wasn't about doubt, nor about loss. It was about recognition. Because even stories that end in pain teach us something essential, that loving is never a waste of time, as long as we learn to love ourselves too. Lara, in turn, decided to accept an invitation from a local university to teach an emotional writing workshop based on real narratives. She spent her afternoons listening to student stories, helping them transform experiences into literature, pain into creation, ruins into language. It fulfilled her in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt useful. She finally felt present in her own life. One of the students, at the end of a class, approached her and said, "You write like someone who has lost everything, yet you still manage to teach how to start over." She smiled and replied, "Because losing everything is what taught me to value what is real." And in that sentence lay a profound truth. It wasn't a stock phrase. It was her scar, elegantly exposed. On a random Sunday, months later, Lara was sitting in a cafe when she saw Daniel pass by on the other side of the street. He was alone, walking with his hands in his pockets, and seemed distracted. She watched him for a few seconds. Her initial impulse was to get up and call him over. But she didn't. Instead, she smiled discreetly, as if she understood that some people only fit into our stories to a certain extent. And that was okay. She got up, paid the bill, and continued on her way, with firm steps and calm breathing. Not because their love was over, but because, finally, she had learned to live without him. And so, silently, the story ended. No miraculous twists, no forced reconciliations, no romantic movie endings. Just people who made mistakes, who loved, who fell, and, most importantly, who chose to move on. Daniel, with the dignity of someone who didn't allow betrayal to define who he was. Clara, as the reflection of a light love that didn't come to erase the past, but to create a new present. And Lara, with the pain of someone who destroyed her own castle but had the courage to rebuild from the rubble. Now tell me, what did you think of this story? Which character touched you the most? Leave your opinion in the comments. I'd love to hear how this story impacted you. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe now, activate the bell, and stay tuned for the next stories to come. And remember, betrayal doesn't just destroy relationships. It destroys trust, identity, families, entire histories. A moment of impulse can cost a lifetime of building. Therefore, every choice we make must be accompanied by awareness and responsibility. This channel does not, in any way, support any type of betrayal. Here, we tell stories that reveal the pain and real consequences it leaves. May this story serve as a warning, but also as a source of reflection. Because some losses are forever. And some loves, when they leave, take with them parts of us that never return.